Hi, everybody. This is David, and welcome to the Module 3 Fireside Chat. And we are looking at inclusive practices, of course. So let's talk about some of the main things that happen here in Module 3. One, my interview with Greg. And Greg was in China, talked about inclusive practices. That was a while ago. I've talked to other people who have been in China, have indicated not a lot of changes for inclusive practices in China. Very interesting, because one of the things I asked Greg is, if you were a wealthy executive or very powerful government official, could you kind of use that influence to have your child with a disability included in a school? For example, even paying for a teacher, paying for an aide, paying for everything. And he said, no, that wasn't the culture at all. And also saying, that if you took a child to a doctor, there wouldn't be a diagnosis coming out of autism or something like that. Even if per what we would identify autism in the U.S., those symptoms were there. So again, it's a cultural, very, very much a cultural definition of China to not identify as having disabilities, not overtly identifying. So, but congratulations to the work that he had done on introducing inclusion to a student with a disability. The David Hyde video. So my interview of David Hyde. Fascinating story. David Hyde, a blind man that I work with, and he shared many stories. One story, though, I remember I worked at CISA 5 in Portage, and for a while David worked there too. And on his first day, and I was working there, and on David's first day, as he walked up the steps to CISA 5, there were pink flamingos on both sides of the steps, okay? So nobody quite understood why that happened. And why that happened, one of the employees felt that he wouldn't be able to find necessarily the ends of the steps. And they did kind of fall off a little bit, so like it wasn't the safest. So they had put these flamingos up to help him navigate. And actually, he never knew they were there because he never got to those sides of the steps. Are pretty wide. So we talked about that later. But that was an example of someone wanting to help out and not really knowing how to do it, or doing it in a manner where they didn't bring it up to anybody else. And that's something Dave and I talked about during the interviews. If you have a question, like he gives an example too of like if he's at a corner, and someone is there also a road, it's fine if they ask him, would you like assistance getting across the road? But some people, in myself included, you might not know what to say, or you might think that the person might actually take offense if you offer something like that. So, if you haven't watched it, I encourage you to go in and watch the video. And it's also very, very upbeat, the stories that Dave tells, and they're things that probably a lot of us have encountered in life just when we come across the unknown. I was very impressed with Savannah's story, Toma High School putting that together. Very, very impressed. And it's one of those things where I'm kind of asking, like, what do you think about that? Because, Savannah highlights, herself and her disability, and brings education to the student body on that. So it's something that helps educate the student body, helps people understand Savannah. And, would you see any downfalls to that where it also, maybe shares too much with other people about, I guess the question would be, well, shouldn't we just include Savannah versus, producing this video to help people understand Savannah? So there's kind of two sides a little bit to this, but I really like how this was done. I like how Toma did this. And to me, it's an educational the educational aspect, because students aren't necessarily probably going to ask Savannah, like, why do you do things like this way? But then by Savannah telling your story, I think it takes down barriers and helps people find the words to ask questions of other things that they don't understand, which is usually too, like if it's, let's say, somebody that has differences, it's like, how do you interact with that person? And then also, how do you do it where you're doing it in a way where you're still respectful of their independence, and you don't want to overstep that. So pretty amazing. The rationale for inclusion was, talked about a lot, and people came up with redundantly, and I'll address it through the shoutouts, some questions about budget and the impact of budget on inclusion. And actually, we get into that in Module 6. And there's an article that came out in February, talks about kind of sharing services across districts, professional development, other services to help stretch a budget for student services. It's very well done. But it is something where, there are dollars that come out from a federal level, IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, but really it's only a few $1,000s per student. So if you have a student with very high needs, a district does end up paying that through district dollars. So budgets definitely do have an influence on inclusion at times. Again, and we'll get into that, even though they probably shouldn't. Inclusion and safety. It's also easy to, in this, I just wanted to bring this up because I had talked about this with somebody else recently, but it's easy to create kind of the other. So when we think about inclusion, think about like all students. So high school, if you were to do a screening for students that you think might be at risk to bring harm to like a high school or dangerous or something, it's likely you're probably going to identify goth dressing kids and things like that, even though there's no correspondence to that in violence. So you get into this real tricky thing of when you start to profile, or any attempts at profiling, which there is no profile, for example, of a school shooter, but not to go down the road of trying to profile. And some of the most frightened people after the Adam Lanza Sandy Hook massacre in 2012, some of the most frightened people were parents of children with autism. For about 2 weeks after the massacre, the media was putting out these claims of, because Adam had autism, did it basically remove his feelings of remorse and make him more prone to be involved in violence. So imagine that you're the parent of a child with autism, and you're in a completely different school district somewhere else, and this is coming out through the media. You'd probably be apprehensive in sending your child to school, because what if the teachers, administration, what if peers are thinking about that? Now, thankfully, the medical community and the greater autism community stepped forward and in about 2 weeks put an end to that. And there was back, that reminds me of back years ago, there was this alleged link between video games and people being violent, but that has never proven out and things like that. So there's actually a book by Austin Kutchner, Grand Theft Childhood, talked about numerous studies. It was out of Harvard. So let's get right into shout-outs. Okay, Rebecca, you developed your history of inclusion in children's literature, picture books, timelines. I'm working from my notes here, everybody. I thought it was really cool that you did that in kind of like this trifold format. I like the way the format was easy to get the information, and kind of a novel way to do it. So I thought that was pretty cool. And you wrote why picture books, and pointing out that in the last decade is really when we've seen an increase in featuring people with special needs in picture books, and not so much before that. So fascinating, really a cool way to look at things. So thanks, Rebecca. Kyle, in a response to a post to Skylar, you wrote, as a professional mindset, I most identify with efficacy data. So basically, you're saying, I want to see the data behind inclusive practices, where it's indicating that a student who is included is going to perform better in whatever areas, or that peers are going to perform as well or better. So my perspective on that is, data makes the argument. So you're right on, Kyle, in saying data makes the argument. For anything, data makes the argument. And to measure inclusion is tricky, and the impact of inclusion, because what variables do you impact, and what does that look like? So, few people are aware of, and I'm going to talk about a way I think we might be able to measure inclusive practices, or look at inclusion in a way that would be kind of non-threatening to people, because I think people don't get too much into inclusion, because it's something where you can, what if you find data that says, inclusion in schools has a negative effect? That's something that I don't know many research, many studies that would want to come out and to put that out there, even, if it was valid, not, of course, that they would change the information, but just the feedback you would get on that. It's just, it goes against and the cultural expectation that we treat everyone with humanity, dignity. So, but I guess it's hard to, what does it really mean to be successful with inclusion? And again, few people in schools, and I know this from working, as an administrator in schools, few people would even be able to tell me how much, like, our fourth graders, let's ballpark our fourth grade students with disabilities, how much are they included during their day? And whatever number we would come up with, and then actually go in and analyze IEP minutes and where the child is, those would typically be quite different. And then we'd have a discussion of, is this something we wanted to target and change, or not? Like, not that the data is good or bad, it's just this is what we thought, and this is what the data is. Maybe there's no other discussion needs to happen. And careful not to steer people down also a path of saying, well, it's 60%. Okay, we really want it to be like 80%. We'll let people come to whatever they feel, or say, no, this model is serving our children. We're considering least restrictive environment appropriately. So that's fine. But again, most people will overestimate the amount of time that students with disabilities are included in classes and underestimate pull-out. So thank you, Kyle. Kelly, in a response to Justin, you wrote of how Ro Vargo's parents were basically shocked when they learned that Ro's friends didn't care or, or even notice her disability. And yeah, that's amazing. And parents do, they're so fearful because they're wondering, is my daughter going to still have friends as she gets older? Is she going to lose her peer group? I'm going to share a story right now. So I was at a conference, and a father was presenting, and he was talking about his daughter, and she, I think, was maybe eighth grade at the time, and she had cerebral palsy. So he's at home, he and his wife, and I don't know, their daughter was somewhere, and two of her daughter's friends knock at the door, show up at the house, and they say, "Can we talk to you and your wife?" And he's thinking, "Oh my goodness, what's wrong?" So let's say the daughter's name is Charlotte. So Charlotte's friends come in and sit down, and the parents are like thinking the worst. They're going to tell us, that they're going to end their relationship as friends with Charlotte, and they just want the parents to know, and for whatever. This is what the parents were thinking. This is what Dad's saying. And they said, "Can we be honest with you?" And of course, parents are like, "Yeah, what's happening?" And then they said, Charlotte is having a birthday, and we want to we kind of want to do a makeover, like, her nails and her hair and things, but, you dress her in sweatsuits, which are like, or sweat clothing, workout clothing. And it was nice stuff, but it was like convenience for the parents. And also, like, her wheelchair is pretty bland. I mean, we know she likes the Backstreet Boys, so like, there was a clear tray attached to the wheelchair, so they wanted to take and then use contact paper and cut out a poster of the Backstreet Boys and put it underneath so you could see it under the tray from the bottom side up. And then, this whole makeover, and all of a sudden the parents were like, oh my goodness, yes. I mean, we've never realized our daughter is kind of getting older and she's becoming a young lady, and we're dressing her, and we're kind of dressing her in a way that's not really fitting in with her group and also like her interest. I mean, we know she likes the Backstreet Boys. We know these things. And so they went out and they got her a pair of jeans, and I think the mom, I know the dad was talking and he had some pictures. The mom bedazzled the jeans. Remember the bedazzler, because the daughter really liked shiny, sparkly clothing. So they did all this. They surprised Charlotte, and she has had a terrific time. But it was one of those things where the parents said, for inclusion, we were not really helping our daughter keep up with her peers, and also just recognizing our daughter's interests. We were maybe overprotective, and then also just doing things more for our convenience and doing things to help her be more expressive, within her social group. So, Lisa, you challenged the efficacy data presented about inclusion. So again, we've talked about this just before. So again, I think there's a big challenge to the logistical aspect of research studies that deal with inclusion. One is they tend to be kind of small populations. And again, what is really being measured? Is it amount of time with other students? Are you surveying other students of like, how do they perceive these peers? Are you just looking at academic scores? Because if you're just looking at like academic scores of like a class, if they have students with disabilities included, well, there's so many variables that affect academic scores. The teacher, the how much sunlight the classroom gets, if there was a turnover in administration, a new curriculum, all these variables that you can never fully account for in this open system. So it'd be really hard to do that. So anyway, this is an area that's wide open for research. It's wide open for research. And I think you also need to make sure that you're talking to students in what would be a qualitative method of research, or getting students narratives, and you're coding out their narratives and things like that. And also, when we do surveys of students, this tends to happen when students get a little bit older. You survey them about school culture and diversity and acceptance. Well, you have to make sure that these surveys are also done at all students' readability level. So one thing I work on with a company that does threat reporting, student threat reporting systems, is we work at working on readability levels. So students with reading disabilities and English language learners have more access to these systems, because otherwise these surveys, kids aren't able to identify and make sense of what they're really being asked in the question. So anyway, this data set around inclusion is really hard, and it probably always will be. It's something that's going to be hard. I mean, just if we go and say, like, what's the benefit of diversity in society? Well, I mean, how do you measure that, and how do you define that? So what variables do you include? What variables do you not include? So, but yeah, so I think any study, I think you have to try to look at different studies and different populations, and they're out there. You can go to jurn.org and things like that. But it's people that take like one research study and they say, like, because of this study, this is pro-inclusion or anti-inclusion or whatever. I think you need to take a few studies, and then the best thing is to figure out your own unit. I mean, of measurement, which is going to be your student body talking to your own students. That's where you're going to get your best information. Mitchell, your inclusion presentation about people with disabilities in the workplace. I appreciate it. It was original. I hadn't seen anybody do that before. You had a slide. So 1947, you noted the President's Committee on National Employment of the Physically Handicapped Week, and that there were billboards, and this was really well publicized. And part of this comes in of, I want to put the context there, after World War II, when soldiers were coming back to the States, and a number of them had disabilities, there was a big push to bring this to the public awareness of campaigns to hire veterans who had, lost a limb or, some other kind of disability related to the war. So I think we framed that out in 1947. Wars, of course, are horrible. What we see after wars are advances in inclusive practices. After the Civil War, we saw a big jump in prosthetics. And it was after World War I, we start to see the guide dogs, start to be provided to soldiers and so forth. And now we're seeing the development of, the high-end carbon fiber limbs and things like that for post-war victims. Not that these things are exclusively tied just to war, but it does seem that war, those are kind of after products that come out as a result of what's happened, to individuals during the war. But Allison, in your post after you read the 10 rationales for inclusion, you questioned if segregation does more harm than good for most students. And I think that's a great question. And it comes, first of all, you have to have a range of least restrictive environments. So when we talk about segregation, if an IEP team comes up and looks and says we can have the student fully in the classroom or like part-time in the classroom, or the student needs to be in a completely different setting and has considerations of those different environments, then if it does come to segregation and the team made it might be in the best interest of the child, might be the best learning opportunity for that child. Ideally, again, you're going to go back every time you have a meeting and revisit that and consider if you can put the child in a step up in the least restricted environment and get closer to being in the classroom. So just an interesting aside on that, I was doing a reading of some study on the millennial population. Now, of course, I mean, everyone is different. So this, but as general characteristics with the millennial population, it was saying a number of the employees, are choosing to work alone and not choosing to work with others. So they'll get their work done, but they'll get it kind of done at their own pace. And that's why, and now these companies kind of forcing people back to the workplace. What is it, Hewlett Packard and some others, you can't work from home anymore. People physically are there, but they're still not working, the millennial population as well in teams. And I think that's just a way that the generation is kind of in general. And we see people interact more to get information from their phones, from the internet, maybe communicating, via the net, short messages, things like that. But it's just a shift. So it's one of these things where it might almost seem like in the workplace we've gotten more segregated recently, when it is kind of just a shift, I think, that's brought on by some technology. Just as a side observation, the article I read I read a couple articles on this, but one article I read kind of came to that conclusion. Is from the outside it might look like, this is nobody's working together and things like this, but it's really like this is the way that the population chooses to do their work. Courtney, your inclusion timeline was about transportation. I thought it was very well done, and your timeline will soon. So where you stopped, it's going to continue, obviously, with these self-driven, fully autonomous vehicles. We're not far off from that, and just think of anybody with a disability or people, that can't, drive at night. People, with freeing up time also for people to do other things. I mean, it's going to be a benefit. But if you have a disability and you haven't traditionally been able to drive because of maybe, reflexes or vision or, whatever, you're going to have these things opened up to you and much more integration into society by having these autonomous vehicles. So I think it's a really exciting time. And I don't think we're far off from it. I mean, we're going to have some issues to work out, like who's liable and what is liable if one vehicle crashes into another and they're both controlled by, computer systems. So, but I think those things will get worked out, and I think it's going to be really exciting. And for persons with disabilities to have these new avenues for transportation is going to be wonderful. So, Danny, you created a timeline of inclusion in sports. So I enjoyed it. And I also had watched a documentary recently about the Rio Paralympics that happened, about a year ago, was it? And the documentary was talking about how the Paralympics, there were challenges that were emerging because people had such advanced like carbon fiber limbs and things like that would that would store energy, and then basically people could run faster than anybody had run before, like whether you had legs or whether or not your legs were these carbon limbs. And they were having some issues with that on two fronts. One is, were you starting to get into the situation of creating kind of this almost hyper bionic science type mechanical being that you could engineer where somebody could run a 2-minute mile or something like that, or could jump so far, or whatever it could be. So was there going to have to be some kind of quote unquote governing put on the devices? And, for example, like NASCAR, I think has where there's certain things where a vehicle can go so fast and then that's it. Like there's certain things on engines and whatever that per the rules that they can't go any faster, and that's for the safety, and that's to kind of keep, so obviously for safety and keep the competition more fair. But they're also running into issues in this documentary where people were having, sore, like hip joints or something like that, because the human body just wasn't designed to move like that fast. And other parts of the body were being strained in ways that they hadn't been strained before. So some of these athletes were encountering some injuries that normally you would never encounter. I mean, imagine if you or I were to run, at faster than anyone else has run over time, what that would do to your joints and things like that. So, so again, very interesting with this inclusion in sports, because we are going to have, for probably the first time ever, I would guess, in the next Paralympics, some real serious discussion on what is going to be permitted and what isn't going to be permitted, which in a way is exciting because it's a testament to how much technology has advanced in the capabilities of people. But part of this, like they said, was just keeping people safe. Like if they go too far, you could have somebody running at, whatever miles per hour, 30, 40 miles an hour. If you fall on a track, you could seriously hurt yourself. I mean, some of this was just down that, train of thought. Jared, you asked if cost savings with inclusion is overhyped. My response to that is, yeah, I think it is overhyped. hyped. And actually, inclusion shouldn't be done for the basis of saving money. If you think about inclusion, if a student does require services, an inclusive model, you're kind of changing those services also to a push-in. So, if it's speech language services, or if it's learning disabilities teacher, autism support, whatever, that they're going into the inclusive setting. So not necessarily you're having this big reduction in staff or anything. What happens when you go with inclusion, sometimes districts will push inclusion for the reason of freeing up space. Now we don't have as many special education quote unquote rooms or pull-out rooms or areas to deliver these services that might have fewer students, be more quiet, or that you can put more sensory items and things like that. And I think I shared a story earlier in this class, but if I didn't, I remember a district doing that not too far from where I'm located a few years ago, went to full inclusion. And the fact was they went to full, a week before school started, went to full inclusion because they were at capacity in their schools and they needed classroom space. And this is the way they were going to do it, is to move their students with disabilities into the classrooms and then take the special education classrooms and just convert them into more regular education classrooms. Remember, I don't like the terms kind of regular ed, special ed. I kind of like all students are regular education students. Some students also have special needs. But Lisa, first, thank you for being a very active poster. Wow, you have posted a ton to this class. Thank you very much. You wrote to Danny. I also think a lot of that comes from fear. Okay, and this is pulling back from inclusion. This was the context. A lot of pulling back from inclusion, comes from fear of the unknown, and I completely think that's true. We need to inform people. That's where that Savannah video really helps, I think, because people might see Savannah in high school and not really understand, and once she helps inform and educate, so that's where I can see a real plus in that. And even in, and we see this throughout society, even in disasters, people want to be informed of what's going on. And if they don't get informed, they easily become fearful, they become angry, and that happens. So, but it is very natural it's a very natural human response, if you're not informed, to kind of pull back until you are informed. I mean, generally, if we encountered any situation that was different to us than what we typically would encounter, we want to learn about that and then how to interface with that. So I think you're right on that. It comes from fear, and fear is there because people don't know. They don't have the information. Once you bring the information forward to people, it rips down those barriers of fear. And you need to have open discussions. It's like if a kid starts school and there's complex needs and things, and you shove some things in the mailbox of the teachers, or send out an email with 10 links of here's everything you need to know about charge syndrome or whatever. It's best to get people together and to give a short presentation, try to give some context of here's a picture of the student who's going to be starting, and here's some things that they like, or whatever it is. But then ask people questions, to ask questions. Say, what do you want to know? What do you want to know about charge, and what haven't I covered? Or I remember talking about David Hyde, a man who's blind, and as he would say, refer to him as a blind man, but a man who's blind. When he was at CISA, there was a gathering. People got together and did a potluck, and then told Dave ahead of time, we want to ask you some questions, and he was totally for it, because and one of the questions somebody said was, if I see you going into the wrong restroom, is it okay if I ask you? And he said, well, of course, because I wouldn't want that. And then, it was just other things if it's slippery outside, do you want some help or not? Or the microwave, it was all things. And pretty soon those questions went aside, and it was just once they were done, you could just feel this tension kind of was gone in the building. And the tension was just people not knowing how to help and not help and just interact. Or even if I enter a room and you're there, do you want me to announce myself or not? Or just these things. So we opened it up. It really was a good thing. And Dave agreed. Selena, your timeline of inclusion included music composers with disabilities. And I liked it. I thought it was very interesting that you included Hank Williams Jr., born in 1949. And I didn't know that he fell off a mountain, cracked his skull, had reconstructive surgery. So I'm thinking of that. And then, of course, you're a singer, so how that must impact you. And then also that you're going to be on stage and performing. So that you need to that's the one thing, I want to bring up too, is like any of us can become disabled at any moment in time. It is the one thing that can strike us at any second. You instantly can't, become, I can't become a Ancestry.com, Chinese in 1 second or something like that. And unless you win the lottery, you're not going to become wealthy or what in a second. But I mean, you can become disability sweeps across everybody. I mean, it's one of these things where it is amazing. So I thought that was fascinating that you included that, and then looking at the perspective of what he would need to have gone through, and I would have never thought it, but. And two, I don't know. Doesn't Hank Williams like have a pretty thick beard and hat and sunglasses stuff? So maybe there's some things that kind of does to not reveal some of those things as much. Not that any of us should matter, but maybe that was something too that just became part of the way that he presented himself. But talk about something that could also change your career. But yeah, he stuck with it. So. Skylar, you mentioned efficacy data. Again, we've talked about this a lot. Now, here's the way I think you can look at efficacy data. Here's two ways I'm going to put out there to look at it, two approaches. One is you can measure outcomes, and schools do this. They're required by law to do this, although this is kind of a fuzzy process. So a couple of years after a student graduates, they're supposed to call that student or email or try to get a hold of that student and ask, like, what are you doing? And then there's connects with the student number, and then there's this report that's supposed to come back to the school of saying, students were engaged in active employment or living on their own or whatever. And a lot of these things, the problem with that is if it takes, it's really geared heavily toward being in post-secondary. So, what if the student graduated and they went and took over part of the family farm and they're doing great and the farm is doing well, but then it's like, well, they didn't go on to post-secondary and some of these things. So these outcome surveys are kind of, geared toward wanting to see students in post-secondary. So that's one way you could look at efficacy of saying, our students with disabilities, and then our amount of inclusion with students with disabilities, and how did our students who are typically in pull-out services do versus push-in services. You'd have to have a little bit of that on your end, but I mean, you could come back and find that through the IEP. The other part is, I'm going to just introduce this. It's called applied decision analysis. There's other ways to do this, but you basically, so again, your efficacy data, if you just go through really and look at your IEP team process or your whole process of once a student starts to struggle, I guess your response to intervention process of what do we do? What's the first thing we do? What's the next thing we do? What are the options that we have? How do we measure growth? And you kind of don't talk about the student outcome as much, but you talk about your process. How often do we get together? Do we feel like we get together enough? What options do we have? Do we have volunteers working with kids? Do we have high school mentors coming down? And, what kinds of programs, how many times during a day are kids getting additional support, things like that. One of the things that's interesting is whenever you examine process typically, and you really get down to examining process, your outcomes improve because you identify ways to make your process better. And it's also a very safe way for people to address things like understanding inclusive practices, because if you start looking and saying, it becomes almost like like a success or fail. Like, we had this many students with disabilities who graduated or graduated in or let's say 71% versus 93% on our non-disabled population. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is, looking at the process of again, from the point of when a student is identified to the types of services that they receive and how you're measuring growth and all of these things. If you just look at that, try to understand that in any ways you can improve that, the outcome's going to get better. It's like the car gets more fuel efficient when you look at all of the different components and the aerodynamics and all of that, and materials to make the engine and things like that, and weight and stuff like that. So people are more willing to do that. People are much more willing to look at a system because they don't feel threatened. But if you just look and it's like, you failed this kid, or this kid was in your class and whatever, which kind of that feeling comes out there, or even for administrators, they get, very defensive on that. So I think, looking at something like applied decision analysis to really understand your process, your efficacy is really measuring like your process. So hopefully that kind of made sense. Allie, you produced the inclusion in media timeline, and 1993 you included the movie What's Eating Gilbert Grape, one of my favorite movies of all time, so thank you for including that. If anyone hasn't seen it, please check it out. What's Eating Gilbert Grape. Johnny Depp starred in it, and Leonardo DiCaprio as Arnie played Arnie, a boy with autism. And it also has the mom is severely obese, and I think that the dad had completed suicide a number of years before. That was referenced in the story. It's a smaller town, I think in Iowa, kind of like a poorer town. They generally accept, they understand Arnie, with disabilities, yet like some of the kids tease him, and there's some of those scenes. It's a very fascinating story, a movie to look at, I think, and maybe have almost a film study with kids. About bullying, about acceptance, about socioeconomic status. There's so many things that get covered in that, and even this kind of transient friend that comes through and meets up with Gilbert then. So I'm not Gilbert. Gilbert. So, who's played by Johnny Depp. So, Brendan. For discussion question 1, you wrote, people from all walks of life and backgrounds will be working with us in every endeavor or down the road. Absolutely. And this was actually, so, the reasons for rationale for inclusion, people from all walks of life are going to be working with us, and more or less, we're going to become a global society if we're not there already. But during World War II, I read some studies and some observational reports done by psychologists working, military psychologists. And one of the things in World War II was the American soldiers came from such diverse backgrounds that it took a while to get commonality. They actually created a series, and Dr. Seuss was part of this. And, Frank Capra, I think it's Why We Fight. You can go on YouTube and find it. It's like 5 or 7 videos. But they actually created this to help people, like if you're from a small farm in Kansas, how you'd relate to someone who might be from, at that time, New York City, or, a urban population. So you didn't have the internet. I mean, if you grew up in a small town in Kansas or Plains or something, you might not have really traveled more, and you're enlisting at 17 in the military. You might not have traveled more than 30, 40 miles ever from your hometown. So there was this need to unify even Americans, because they weren't really aware of the cultural differences from region to region. So that was one of the purposes of putting together this video series, was, we all have differences as Americans, but we're all alike in wanting these values as Americans. It is a propaganda campaign too, but again, that was kind of an interesting thing, as they were finding just how different soldiers were, and it wasn't easy for them necessarily to form these relationships with each other and be able to kind of speak the same language and trust each other. The solidifying event, you'd go through things during the war which would solidify you. And, the movie Forrest Gump, I think, kind of shows some of that too. Justin, you mentioned inclusion relative to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think that's a very keen observation that you made. So one is, needing control over one's self. So, if someone is making a decision and you're not a part of it, of like, this is where you're going to be spending part of your day, and these are the services that you're going to receive, and this is the program. This is why it's important to try to get students involved in their IEPs as much as possible, and even their own learning plans, just in their own learning and being able to set goals, whether they have IEPs or not. The other is a control over one's environment, that, a student has control, can make choices, they have choices available to them. I once listened to a presenter on behavior, and it was phenomenally said that even giving students a choice of, okay, you have this assignment to do, and here's white paper or here's green paper, which one would you like to do it on? Students were much more likely to engage in that activity than if it was like, okay, here's the assignment that you have to do, and then it was just like, here's the sheet, because there wasn't a choice involved in it. And actually, when we go on, later in this class, Universal Design for Instruction, indicating giving students a numerous, array of ways to represent learning. And at least, maybe for a couple assignments, you can do a YouTube video, you can, do a pamphlet, or you can, do a podcast, you can do a poster or something like that, whatever it might be, but it would have to fit like some rubric components, demonstrating that you understand the concept of whatever. Maybe it's like effects of positive and negative effects of humans on the environment, or something like that. Or having divergent activities too, I think is really important. You talk about inclusion, so if kids, a scenario like, how could we run a city like with little pollution, and you gave students, so right there, that's a divergent scenario. So you could say you could use these types of materials or whatever, or versus convergent of having a very objective, like it has to be this answer. So like, how far is it from here to the moon or something like that, or the order of the planets or things like that. I mean, that's all going to be objective and whatever, but coming up with things that allow students to be divergent. And Dustin, in response to Jared, you wrote, can the schools agree, or can the schools argue against findings made by medical professionals? So basically saying, and this post was made of, what if a parent comes to you and says, my child's doctor said my child has ADHD and needs these services, or has a learning disability in school, you need to provide these. Well, that happens a lot. And some schools I know have they've written their local doctors, or they've offered to meet with them. And this happened in Dane County maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. The special education directors were getting a lot of referrals from doctors, not referrals, like orders, saying this student should receive special education services for learning disability, just be vague like that. And needing to educate the doctor, saying, well, that doesn't mean anything in the schools. If you just write an order like that, we have to go through an evaluation process. Student has to qualify. You can medically identify students as having like an anxiety disorder or something like that, and then the school would consider if there might be like a 504 accommodation or something like that, for the student. If it's like a high school anxiety, maybe they arrive 10 minutes after everybody else arrives for the day. I don't know, things like that. But no, doctors can't write orders. And it's not only doctors. I mean, it becomes therapists. And I remember a friend of mine who's a director who said, yes, there was a therapist that frequently come to meetings and was very willing then to, and it was students with emotional behavioral needs, was very willing then to say, well, here's a suggestion. I can come to the school and meet with a student like twice a week at like this fee, and you can buy my materials, my books, and we can use these programs, and I can train your staff. So, I mean, it was this whole thing of, whoa, like we reserve the right to select methodology. And there, with that said, you need to have good third-party relationships and good, releases with doctors and third parties and working together. But yeah, and usually doctors do this because the parents, ask them to do it, and they're just not aware of how the schools function. Or the parent might say, the school's not identifying my child, they test him, whatever, and then the doctor might write that. Again, I think doctors are getting better at that, but that still happens quite a bit from the medical profession. It's complicated to deal with. So, all right, everybody, thank you very much. We got this one done a little faster. And continue to be active posters in class. And toward the end of the week, I'll open up Module 4. And, hey, we're getting there. What do we have? I think from today we have, just about 2 months to go. So thank you very much. Any questions, email me, or anything you want me to address during the Fireside chat, please do that. Thank you.